The candle had guttered to a thumb's height when the master of the house came down the corridor unannounced, and Bridget Calrow, on her knees at the cold grate with the ashpan balanced across her apron, understood in one breath that she had been caught reading. Not the grate, the letter. The single sheet she had lifted from the floor beneath his writing table, the one that had slid there weeks ago and lain forgotten in the dark seam between the boards and the wainscot, the one whose first line she had taken in before she could stop herself. She had been taught her letters by a father who copied deeds for a living, and a woman who can read does not unsee a sentence merely because it was not meant for her eyes. The Earl of Cadmore stopped in the doorway. He did not raise the lamp he carried. He only looked at her, and at the paper in her bare red hand, and at the place on the floor from which it had plainly come. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire she had not yet laid sat dead in the grate. Somewhere above them in the nursery wing, a boy coughed in his sleep and was quiet. "You can read," he said. It was not a question, and he did not say it gently. Bridget rose. She set the ashpan down with both hands, so it would not rattle and betray her, and she held the letter out to him, across the space between them, flat on her palm, the way one offers a thing one has no right to keep. "I can, your grace," she said, and then, because the lie of station was easier than the truth of the page, "My lord, forgive me." It had fallen. I did not go looking. He took the sheet. He did not look at it. He looked at her, and what was in his face was not anger, or not only anger, but something colder and more frightened than anger. The look of a man who has kept a door locked for 3 years and just heard the latch lift in another room. "What did you read?" he said. She might have lied. A wiser maid would have lied. The fire wanted laying. The morning was 3 hours off. And a girl who cleaned the study of the Earl of Cadmore for £11 a year, and her keep did not contradict the man who paid them. Yet Bridget Calrow had been raised by a clerk who told her that a copied word was a kept word, that ink did not forgive a falsehood, and that the worst thing a person could do was to know a true thing and let it pass for a false one, because the false one was more comfortable. "I read that one of your sons is not your wife's son," she said. "And I read that you have known it since the night the younger was born." The lamp in his hand trembled only once, and then went still. That was all. That was the whole of his answer, in that first hour. He turned and walked out of the study, and left her kneeling there in the cold, and she laid the fire with shaking hands, and she did not sleep, and when the household rose, she went down to the kitchen and waited to be dismissed. She was not dismissed. That was the first strange thing. To understand why a housemaid came to be reading her master's letters at 4 in the morning, one must go back 6 months to the 3rd week of her service, when Bridget first set foot in Cadmore Hall, with everything she owned tied in a square of grey cloth, and the memory of her father's funeral still raw as a burn. She had been a clerk's daughter in a market town with a small, respectable life and the expectation of a small, respectable marriage, until the fever took her father in a single week, and took with him the income that had kept their rooms, their books, and her standing. The man, she had been half promised to marry a glover's daughter with £40 a year. Bridget sold the books to bury her father, and when the books were gone, she sold her standing, and went into service, because a roof is a roof, and a clerk's daughter who can read and figure and hold her tongue is worth more in a great house than she will ever be paid. Cadmore Hall sat in a fold of grey Pybury country, all weathered stone and tall, cold windows, with a churchyard at the end of the lime walk where St. Wilfrida's kept its bones. The house had a widower in it, and 2 motherless boys, and a silence laid over all of it, like dust sheets over furniture in a closed wing. The late Countess, Variance, had died 3 years before, in the same winter that had given her the younger of her 2 sons. Bridget learned this in her first week from Mrs. Bell. Pinching the housekeeper, a square, decent woman who carried the keys and the grief of the place in equal weight, and who had decided on no evidence Bridget could name, to be kind to her. "You will clean the master's study," Mrs. Bry, Pinching had said, "and you will move nothing he has set down, and you will not speak of what you see on his table, because what is on a gentleman's table is the gentleman's affair, and not a word of yours. Do you take my meaning?" Bridget had taken her meaning. For 5 months she had kept it exactly. She dusted the long shelves with their leather spines, and their gilt that had gone dull. She blacked the grate and laid the fire, and carried out the ash. She wiped the inkstand and squared the blotter, and never once turned a page that lay face up. Because a maid who reads her master's papers is a maid who will be turned out without a character. And a girl without a character in that country, in that year, was a girl who would not eat. The Earl she saw rarely and at a distance. He was a tall man of 32, with dark hair going early to gray at the temple, and a jaw that the maids below stairs called carved. A man who rode out before the household, woke and came back gray with cold, who sat long hours alone with the door shut, who spoke to his sons with a tenderness that seemed to cost him something, and to everyone else with a flat, exhausted courtesy that asked nothing and gave less. The county had decided long ago what he was. To Pybury he was the cold Earl, the grieving Earl, the man who had loved his wife to distraction, and buried his heart with her and would never marry again, and the county said it the way the county says everything, with certainty and without knowledge. The 2 boys were the light of the house, and the whole of its trouble, though. Bridget did not yet know the trouble. The elder, Cosmo, was 8, a grave, careful child with his late mother's fair coloring, and a way of standing very still when grown people raised their voices as though stillness might make him invisible. The younger Hartwin was 3 that winter, dark like his father, a loud, merry creature forever underfoot, who had cost his mother her life in the bearing and did not know it, and was loved without stint by the brother who might have hated him for it and did not. Bridget would see them sometimes from the back stairs, the big boy carrying the small one pickaback down a gallery, and the sight of it would catch in her chest in a way she did not examine. She would have gone on dusting and never reading. She would have kept Mrs. Pinching's rule for 40 years and gone gladly to her grave, never knowing what lay under the floor. The thing that broke the rule was not curiosity. It was a draught. A bad sash in the study window let a draught along the floor on east wind nights, and the draught had worried at a corner of paper that had slid weeks before into the dark seam behind the writing table, and on the night the candle guttered to a thumb's height, the draught had finally walked it out into the open where her cloth found it. She had picked it up to lay it on the table the way she laid up every fallen thing. And her eye, the traitor eye her father had trained, had read the first line before her hand could decide to be blind. After that, there was no being blind. So she had read it through, kneeling, in the cold, while the household slept. And then the master had come down the corridor, and that was where the true story of Bridget Cowrow began. The letter was in the late Countess's hand. Bridget knew it was the Countess's hand because she had dusted the framed sampler in the morning room 100 times, the one stitched B for blessings and worked with the same looping V, and the sheet under the table opened with that same looping hand, my dearest, and what it said in the plain agony of a woman who knew she was dying, that the elder boy, the grave fair child Cosmo, the heir, the boy the whole county took for the Earl's firstborn and the lawful issue of the marriage, had been born to the Countess before her marriage, by another man, in another county, under another name, and given out at the time as a foundling taken in by the family's charity, and raised at Cadmore as the Earl's own son, because the Earl had loved Variance enough to claim the child as his, and sealed the claim in a parish book, and never once let the boy feel for a single hour that he was anything but a son. The letter begged the Earl to keep the secret to his grave. It begged him to let Cosmo inherit, to let the lie stand, because the lie had made the boy safe, and the truth would unmake him. And it ended, my dearest. The younger is yours, and the elder is mine. And both are ours. Forgive me, forgive me. B. Bridget had read it once, kneeling. And then the Earl had come, and now she stood in the kitchen at dawn waiting to be sent away with everything she owned in a square of gray cloth. And she found she could not stop her hands from shaking, not from fear of the road, but from the weight of the thing she now carried, which was a great deal heavier than ash. She was sent for at noon, not below stairs where a maid is dismissed, to the study, where she had knelt at the grate. The Earl stood at the window with his back to the room, and the grey pieberry light on his shoulders. He did not turn at once when he did. The cold the county spoke of was all in his face, and under the cold something raw that the county had never been let near. "You will tell me what you intend to do," he said, "with what you read." "Nothing, my lord. People say nothing and mean money." "I am not people," Bridget said, and heard her own boldness with a kind of distant horror, and could not unsay it, and did not want to. "I am a clerk's daughter. My father copied other men's secrets for 30 years and never sold one, and he was buried poor for it, and proud. I will not be the thing he was too honest to be." Something moved behind the Earl's eyes. He looked at her then, as though for the first time he were seeing the particular person standing on his hearthrug, and not merely the maid-shaped danger that had read his wife's last letter. "Your father," he said. "What was his name?" "Calrow, my lord, of the market town at Wexenmere. He copied deeds and wills and articles for the attorneys there. Mr. Felbridge of that town will speak for him if a dead man wants a character." Felbridge. The Earl said the name slowly as a man turns a coin to read the far side. "I know Felbridge. He has drawn papers for this house." He was quiet a moment. "Then you will understand the next thing I say to you. The letter you read is the only proof in the world that the boy who will one day be the Earl of Cattenmore is not of my blood. While it existed under that floor, I did not know whether to burn it or keep it. You have decided the question for me." He crossed to the grate, and Bridget understood what he meant to do, and a sound came out of her before thought. "My lord, do not." He stopped, the letter an inch from the laid fire. "If you burn it," she said, fast, the clerk's daughter in full now, the years of watching her father unpick the disasters of careless men pouring out of her. "You burn the only thing that says she meant Cosmo to inherit. You think the letter is the danger. The letter is the shield. The danger is the parish book." He straightened. "Explain." "You sealed the claim in a parish book. You said it yourself just now. You put it about and registered it that Cosmo was born to you and your wife in lawful wedlock. That register is the proof the world will read. As long as the register says what you made it, say the boy is safe. A register can also be questioned. A register can be searched by anyone with a reason and a right. And if one day a man with a reason finds a gap or a wrong date or a hand that does not match, he will pull on that thread, and the letter in your hand will be the only thing in the world that tells the true shape of it, which is that you knew, and chose, and loved the boy enough to make him yours in the eyes of the law before he was a week old. Burn the letter and you keep the lie clean today. You also leave Cosmo with no friend in the record if the lie is ever pulled apart. A lie wants a witness who can tell why it was told kindly. Burn the only witness, and you leave the boy to be judged by strangers who will only ever see the lie." The Earl of Cattenmore stood very still. The fire he had nearly fed burned low and ordinary in the grate. After a while he folded the letter along its old creases and put it inside his coat, against his chest, and Bridget let go a breath she had not known she was holding. "You are a dangerous woman, Calrow," he said. There was no cruelty in it. There was something almost like the first thaw of respect, and under that deeper, a thing he would not have named for a kingdom. "I am a careful one, my lord. Why should a man with a reason and a right ever come searching my parish book?" And there Bridget hesitated, because here was the thing she had not yet said, the thing she had worked out in the kitchen at dawn while her hands shook, the thing that turned a dead woman's confession into a living woman's danger. "Because there is a man," she said, "with both. And he has already begun." What she had seen, in 5 months of dusting a study she was forbidden to read, was more than she had let herself understand, until the letter forced the pieces into a picture. She had seen Mr. Lewin Crockley come and go. Crockley was the Earl's cousin on the father's side, a smooth, fair gentleman of 40, with soft hands and a soft voice, and a habit of standing too near the fire in other men's houses. He was, Bridget had gathered below stairs, without trying, the heir presumptive. If the Earl of Caddenmore died without a lawful son, Caddenmore Hall, and the title and the £4,000 a year that came with them passed to Lewin Crockley. And the Earl had a lawful son, the grave fair boy Cosmo, 8 years old, and safe and asleep upstairs, who stood between Crockley and everything Crockley wanted, and who was the one person in the world whose claim a forged confession could undo. Bridget had seen Crockley in the study 3 times in 5 months when the Earl was out riding. She had thought nothing of it, a cousin waiting on a cousin, a gentleman warming himself at the fire. She had cleared the cold tea things after him, and squared the blotter he had disarranged, and never once turned the pages he had been turning. Now, with the Countess's letter burning a hole behind the Earl's ribs, she understood what a gentleman with soft hands had been doing alone in his cousin's study, 3 times, in 5 months. He had been searching the parish book of the Earl's keeping for the very thread the Countess had begged her husband to hide. And a fortnight ago, on the last of those mornings, Bridget had carried out the ash and found in the cold grate a corner of paper that had not burned with a date upon it, in a hand she now knew the Countess's. Looping hand, and she had thought, foolishly, that the master had been clearing out old accounts. He had not. Lewin Crockley had been there that morning. And what had burned in that grate, Bridget now understood, with a cold that went to the bone, was a page Crockley had not wanted found, because he had already found what he was looking for and meant to be the only man alive who knew the true shape of it. She told the Earl all of this, standing on his hearthrug at noon, plainly in order, the way her father had taught her to lay out a tangled matter so that another man could follow it. And the Earl, who had buried his heart with his wife and let the county call him cold, listened to a housemaid lay out the ruin of his house, and at the end of it he sat down in the chair at his writing table as though his legs had stopped serving him, and put his face in his hands and said very low, "Then he means to wait until I am dead, and bring it out, and put Cosmo on the road as a bastard, and take the boy's name and the boy's house, and there will be no one to say it was done in love. There will be one," Bridget said. He looked up. "Me," she said. "I have read the letter. I know the hand. I knew your wife's hand from the sampler before I ever knew her grief. If it comes to a hearing, I can swear what the letter says and why you did it, and a court that hears a clerk's daughter who never took a shilling for a secret may weigh her word against a smooth man's evidence. It is thin, my lord. I will not pretend it is not thin. It is not nothing, though, and a moment ago you had nothing and were about to burn even that." The cold Earl of Caddenmore looked at his housemaid for a long time. Then he did a thing that no one in the county would have believed of him. He stood, and he crossed the room, and he held out his hand to her, not to be kissed, not in command, but the plain offered hand of one person to another, across a thing too large to manage alone. "Then we are not nothing," he said. "Help me, Miss Calrow, and I will never forget it." It was the first time anyone at Caddenmore had called her Miss. So began the strange season of Bridget Callow's life, in which a housemaid and an earl kept a secret war against a smiling cousin, and the household went on around them not knowing, and the grate was blacked, and the fires were laid, and the ash was carried out as though nothing in the world had changed. Bridget did not stop being a maid. That would have raised every eyebrow below stairs, and every one of them belonged, in the end, to a person who might talk. She rose at 5, and dusted the long shelves and squared the blotter. And the only difference was that now, when the Earl was certain they were alone, he would set a paper before her on the table face up and say, "Read this, Miss Calrow, and tell me what a clerk would see." What a clerk saw was this: the parish register of St. Wilfreda's, in which Cosmo's birth had been entered 3 weeks after the fact in the Earl's own hand, had at some time been removed from the locked chest in the vestry, carried, and returned. Bridget knew it had been carried because the Earl, on her asking, rode to Pybury and looked and came back grey, and said the chest's old wax seal was broken and reset clumsy, the second seal pressed by a thumb that did not know how the first had been laid. Someone had taken the register out, and the register when the Earl had it brought up to the hall under guard of his own steward, Mr. Bia. Threepwood, who could be trusted because he had carried the late Countess's coffin, and wept doing it, showed a thing that made Bridget set down her cloth and grip the edge of the table. The page that recorded Cosmo's birth had been altered. Not crudely. By a patient hand with the right ink and the right pen, a hand that had practiced. The year had been scraped and rewritten. Where the Earl had entered in his grief and haste 8 years before, a date that made the boy comfortably the issue of the marriage, some later hand had lifted a digit and laid down another, so that now the register said Cosmo had been born 4 months before the Earl and Variance were wed. He has not destroyed the proof of the lie, Bridget said slowly, the whole shape of it opening before her like a deed unrolled. He has improved it. He does not need to prove the boy is another man's son. He has only to prove the boy was born before the marriage. A child born before the wedding is no heir, whoever the father. He has changed one figure in a book and made your son a bastard with a pen. And the beauty of it, the cruelty of it, is that the figure he changed it to is the truth. Cosmo was born before the marriage. Your wife's own letter says so. So if you cry out that the register has been altered, and a court takes the register down to the vestry and compares it and finds the change, they will ask which date is true, and the true date is his. The Earl had gone very white. Then the letter damns us twice over. It is the only thing that explains the kindness, and it is the only thing that proves the date he wants proved. Yes, Bridget said, which is why he burned the page in your grate a fortnight ago. He did not burn a part of the letter. He burned a copy he had made of the date in your hearth, so that if ever the question came to law there would be ash in your own grate, and a servant to swear she found it, and the trail would run back to you, the grieving husband who had every reason to forge his son legitimate. He has not only made the case against your son, he has made you the forger. He is a patient man, my lord. He has been at this since before I came. This was the active shape of the thing, and Bridget made the Earl see it whole, because half seen it could only frighten him, and whole seen it could be fought. Lewin Crockley had not blundered into a secret. He had hunted it. He had courted the old midwife who had attended the Countess's confinements, Mrs. Caudle of Pybury, gone deaf and poor and frightened, and had got from her, over many soft visits and some money, the whisper that the elder boy had not come the way a wedded child comes. He had taken the register out of the vestry chest and altered one figure with the skill of a man who had bought skill. He had laid a false trail of ash in the Earl's own grate to make the Earl the guilty party. And he had done all of it slowly, deniably, without ever once raising his voice, so that when the Earl at last died, Crockley could come forward grave and reluctant, produce the altered register, produce the frightened midwife, lament the necessity, and take a boy's name and house with the law tipping its hat to him. He guarded what he had built. The register he had returned to a sealed chest he believed no one would think to open while the Earl lived. The midwife he kept frightened and fed. The copy he had burned every flank he had thought of. He was not an absent villain stumbling into fortune. He was a careful man who had armored his lie at every joint, and a careful man is beaten only by a more careful one. "What can we do?" the Earl said, "against the thing so well made?" It was the only time in that season Bridget heard the cold man sound like a frightened one, and it moved her more than any tenderness could have, because it was offered to her, a maid, as though her answer might be the one that mattered. "We do what my father did," she said, "with a forged deed. We do not try to prove the lie is a lie, because his lie is half true, and that is what makes it strong. We find the one true thing he could not change, and we set it where the world must look at it. He altered the year of the birth. He could not alter the year of the marriage, because that is entered in a register he never touched in another parish where your bens were called, and he could not alter the christening." The Earl looked at her without understanding, and she went on. "The deed unrolling. A child is born once, and registered once, and that register he has reached. A child of this house is also christened, my lord, in the chapel, before witnesses. and that is entered again in the chapel book in the chaplain's hand, with the godparents named, and the date set down by a man who had no reason on earth to lie. If Cosmo was christened on a date, and the godparents stood up and are living, and remember the spring or the snow of it, and the chapel book and the marriage register agree, then the year Crockley scraped into the parish book stands alone, contradicted by 2 honest records and the living memory of named persons, and the world will see one altered figure in a sea of true ones, and ask who profited by the change. He guarded the parish book. He never thought of the chapel. The Earl of Cadmore sat down again, but this time not as a man whose legs had failed him. He looked at the maid on his hearthrug as though she had handed him back his son out of deep water. "The chapel book is in the muniment room," he said. "Behind the second seal my own father set. I have not opened it since Variance died." He stopped. The godparents. Cosmo's godfather was old Threepwood's brother, the steward's own brother, who held him at the font and is living yet at Coldhope and sound as a bell. And his godmother. Here the Earl's voice changed. His godmother was Variance's own sister who is living, and who has never once been told a boy is not her sister's husband's son, and who loved him as she loved her sister, and who would walk through fire to swear to the day she stood for him. Then we have honest records and living witnesses, and a man who profited by one scraped figure, Bridget said. "It is no longer thin, my lord. It is a rope. A rope, though, must be kept from the man who would cut it, and here the season turned dangerous, because Lewin Crockley was not a man to leave a flank open once it was shown to him. And it was shown to him, as such things always are, by a small thing carelessly done." Mrs. Sellers, pinching, who knew nothing of any of it, mentioned over the still-room accounts that the master had sent his steward to fetch the chapel book up from the muniment room, and a footman heard her, and the footman was the same who carried Crockley's horse to the stable when the cousin came visiting. And Crockley, who paid soft attention to every soul in that house, learned within the week that the Earl had opened the one door he had not thought to guard. He came to Cadmore the following Tuesday, smiling, with his soft hands and his soft voice, and Bridget, carrying coal up the back stairs, heard him in the hall telling the Earl how very anxious he had been for them all, how the loss of dear Variance still lay on the house, how a man alone with 2 boys ought to think of the future, and not let old griefs make him careless. He stayed to dinner. He stayed the night. And in the dark of that night, Bridget Calrow, who had not slept well since the candle guttered, heard a board creak in the corridor that ran past the study to the locked muniment room, and rose, and took no candle, and went down in her shift and bare feet along the cold stone she scrubbed by day, and saw by the grey of a high window the smiling cousin on his knees at the muniment door with a thin blade at the second seal. She did not cry out. A maid who cries out in the night against a gentleman is a mad maid, a dismissed maid, a maid whose word is worth nothing in the morning. She went back the way she had come, soundless, and she woke the steward, Mr. Purback, Threepwood, who slept above the gun-room, and she woke Mrs. Pinching, and she did a thing that her father would have known to do, which was to make the cousin's crime witnessed by honest persons before he could finish it, so that the deed itself would damn him and not her bare word. The 3 of them came down together with a lamp, the steward and the housekeeper and the maid, and they came not silently but talking, an ordinary household roused by an ordinary noise. And when the lamp turned the corner of the corridor, it fell full on Mr. Rowland. Lewin Crockley, kneeling at his cousin's muniment door with a blade in his hand, and the second seal half lifted, and there was no soft voice in the world that could have explained it. He tried, of course. He rose smooth and quick, and said he had heard a thief, that he had come to defend the house, that the blade was a thief's dropped blade. He had only that moment picked up, and he said it well, and to a single startled maid he might have carried it. He said it, though, to a steward who had carried the Countess's coffin, and a housekeeper who held the keys to that very door and knew no thief had any business at a muniment seal, and a clerk's daughter who stood in her shift with her chin up and said, levelly in the lamplight, "Mr. Fond." Threepwood. The seal is broken and reset once already. By the same hand. A fortnight before I found ash in the study grate. Look at the wax. It will tell you it has been lifted twice. And Threepwood looked, and the wax told him, and the smiling cousin's smile came off his face all at once like a mask cut from its strings. The Earl was at the head of the corridor by then in his shirt, and he did not shout, and he did not strike his cousin, though the right was in his hands, and the law would have looked away. He only said, in the flat, cold voice the county knew, "You will leave my house, Lewin, and you will leave it now. And Mr. Threepwood and Mrs. Pinching and Miss Calrow will swear before any court in England to what they have seen tonight, and so the matter will go to law. Not as your word against mine, but as 3 honest persons against a man caught lifting a seal in the dark." And Lewin Crockley, who had built his lie so patiently and armored it at every joint, stood in his cousin's corridor with the blade fallen from his hand, and understood that he had been beaten not by luck, and not by an accident, but by a maid who had watched him for 5 months and remembered, who had found the one true record he could not reach, and set witnesses upon him before he could cut the rope. He had counted every flank but the one that mattered, which was the person no gentleman thinks to count, the woman on her knees, at the grate. The matter did go to law, in its slow, careful way, over the months that followed. And Bridget had been right that it would be no quick, clean triumph. The world is just but slow. There were depositions taken in cold rooms, and Mr. Felbridge of Wexenmere came up to draw the papers and knew Bridget's father's hand the moment he saw her copy, and treated her, before the gentlemen present, as a clerk's daughter and not a maid, which she would remember all her life. The frightened old midwife, Mrs. Orse Caudle, when she understood that her whisper was to be used to put an 8-year-old boy on the road, found in her deafness and her poverty a last courage, and told the truth of what Crockley had paid her and asked her to say, and her honesty, bought back from her own fear, was the thing that broke the case past mending. The chapel book and the marriage register agreed, as Bridget had known they would. The godmother, Variance's sister, stood up grey and steady and swore to the day she had held the boy at the font, and wept once in the corridor afterward, in Bridget's arms, a countess weeping on a housemaid because the housemaid was the only one near. And the altered figure in the Paris book stood alone. At last, one scraped year in a sea of true records, with a man who profited by it caught lifting a seal in the dark. And the law, slow and sure, set it right. Lewin Crockley was not destroyed. That is not how it ends in a country that is just but slow. He was not hanged, nor ruined past living, nor made into a thing for children to fear. He was exposed and disgraced, and put quietly out of the succession and out of the county, sent to live small and far, on an allowance the Earl, to everyone's amazement, settled on him, because the Earl said once and only once, "A man who hangs his own cousin teaches his sons that blood is cheaper than mercy." Crockley went, and was corrected, and the smile that had warmed itself at other men's fires was not seen in that country again. And Cosmo remained what he had always truly been, whatever a register said, which was the son of a man who had chosen him before he could speak, and the heir of Caddenmore, and a grave fair boy who would grow into a steadier earl for having been, without ever knowing it, fought for. For the boys never knew. That was the Earl's one fixed condition, and Bridget's own deep wish, that the war fought over Cosmo's name should be fought above his head and out of his hearing, so that the child should grow up never feeling for a single hour what the letter had begged he never feel. Cosmo grew up believing himself his father's son, and was in every way the word can mean past blood, and carried his little brother pickaback down the galleries, and the secret stayed where the dying countess had wished it, kept now by a maid as faithfully as it had been kept by a husband. Something had changed, though, in the cold house, and everyone below stairs felt it before they could name it, and Mrs. Pinching named it first, to the still room, with the satisfaction of a woman who has watched a thing she hoped for come true against all odds. The master had begun to come down to the study not to be alone, but to find a particular person in it. He had begun to set papers before the maid, who dusted his shelves. and to listen his gray eyes on her face, while she read them out, in her clear clerk's voice. He had begun to say her name, Bridget, not Calrow, not Miss Calrow, the bare given name, the way a man says a name he has been turning over in private for a long time, before he dares it aloud. She had stopped being only the maid who cleaned his study some months before either of them admitted it. The admitting, when it came, was as quiet as everything else in that house. It came on a gray afternoon in the lime walk that ran down to St. Wilfreda's, where the Earl had asked her to walk with him, openly in sight of the windows, which was itself a kind of declaration. In a country that watched, they walked at the proper distance, and the bare autumn trees stood black against the soft Pybury sky. And at the turn of the walk the Earl of Cadmore stopped and turned to face her, and did not reach for her hand because he was a man who had learned restraint in a hard school and would not spend it cheaply even now. "The county will say a great many things," he said. "If a man of my name marries a woman who carried his ash, the county says a great many things, my lord, and knows almost none of them." A thing happened then at the corner of his carved mouth that the maids below stairs had wagered for a year they would never see, which was that the cold Earl of Cadmore very nearly smiled. "They called you a dangerous woman," he said. "I find I have decided I cannot do without the danger." And he said the rest plainly in the level voice that derived its authority, not from his rank, but from the cost of saying it a sentence, short and specific and irrevocable, in the open in sight of the windows where the world that had judged them both could see it done. "Marry me, Bridget Callow, and be the mistress of this house you have already saved." She did not answer at once. She looked down the lime walk to the grey church where his wife was buried, and she thought of a dying woman's letter that begged a secret be kept, and she understood that she would keep it now as a wife as faithfully as she had kept it as a maid, and that the keeping was a kind of marriage to variance too. Promise made between two women who had loved the same children across the wall of death. Then she looked back at the living man before her, who had offered a clerk's daughter the plain hand of his whole life. "I will," she said. They were married before the next spring, quietly, at St. Wilfreda's, with the steward and the housekeeper standing up for them, and the two boys in their good coats. The elder grave, and the younger loud. And the godmother, who was a countess, weeping again, happily this time. There was no county splendor and no settlement of £40 a year, and no Glover's daughter anywhere in it. There was a man who had been called Cold, and a woman who had been called only the Maid, standing in the same grey church where the whole tangled matter had hung in the balance, choosing each other in front of God and Pybury and the slow, just world. If you have stayed with their story this far, you might carry one small thing away from it, the thing Bridget's father taught her over 30 years of other men's secrets, which is that a true word kept honestly is worth more in the end than a comfortable lie, and that the person no one thinks to count is so often the one. The rest of it belongs to them. The study at Cadmore was cleaned, after that by another girl, a Pybury child, glad of the place, and Bridget showed her the bad sash that let the draught along the floor on east wind nights and told her gently to lay up every fallen thing she found and to read none of it. And the girl promised, and mostly kept the promise, the way Bridget mostly had. The Countess's letter was not burned. It lay folded in a small locked box that Bridget kept, against the day, far off, when one of the boys might be a grown man who could bear to know how completely he had been loved, or against the day no one could foresee when an old defense might be needed again. She did not look at it often. She did not need to. She knew the hand. On a winter evening near the year's turn, with the fire she no longer laid burning warm and ordinary in the grate, and the younger boy asleep at last, and the elder reading by the candle and her husband come quiet into the room with the cold of the lime walk still on his coat, Bridget sat in the study she had once cleaned, and now owned, and she watched the firelight move on the dull gilt of the leather spines she had dusted in another life. And she did not think of the road, or the grey cloths she had carried her life in, or the man who had married the Glover's daughter. She thought only that the house was warm, and the boys were safe, and the true thing she had known, and not let pass for a false one, had brought her, by the slow, sure road of the just world, all the way home. Has... The Earl set his cold hand over her warm one on the arm of the chair, and neither of them spoke, and outside the tall windows the first snow of the year came down soft over Pyebury, and over the grey church, and over the bones of a woman whose last secret two living people would keep, between them to the end.